What's going on, everybody? It's Dilmer and welcome to the channel. So in today's video, I'm going to continue with the ChatGPT video series where we're basically going to be calling into ChatGPT OpenAI API to basically get code that we can run in Unity in runtime by using the Roslyn compiler that we embedded on the previous videos. This video is also going to be restructuring the code so that we can actually call into the API instead of using the ChatGPT wrapper that I showed you previously, where we implemented the Python ChatGPT wrapper, which worked great, but it's not officially supported. So I want to show you and do something that is more official, that is going to work for production. So let's jump into my computer and start working on it. What I'm going to be doing is we're going to be implementing that, right? So we need to make a couple of changes to our code. So if I go in here and I look at the ChatGPT client, which I also have a game object for, if you remember, we have an API URL, and that URL is basically calling into a Python service, which is great if you want to use that, but that is not supported, so we're going to be changing that. It also takes in an API key, and it's also going to be taking an organization, so we need to make some changes to this implementation. So the first thing that I need to do, though, is the object that we're passing in here to the ChatGPT settings needs to be modified. So if I go in here, we're going to have to add a couple of more things because ChatGPT requires additional information. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a string, and this one is going to be the actual model. There's going to be two models, and the way that it works is basically one provides you with more tokens than another, and I'm not really 100% sure how they work, but all I know is there's two different models that you can use, and I'll show you those in just a minute. So we can also use another thing here that we're going to be having to specify. So it's going to be the API organization. So I'll show you where we can get this information from. So that's pretty much what we need to modify on this object. So if we go into the actual reference, which I pulled from their documentation, as you can see, this is going to be the API that we're going to be calling. And I'm not going to be using this through Python. We're going to be doing this from Unity. So there's going to be two different models that we can use. I believe I'm using this GPT 3.5 Turbo. There's also one which is 0301, which I believe it allows you to basically specify more tokens, and which means that you can get more data back, but I'm not 100% sure of that. You guys can look into that. But the model that we specify is going to be either this one or this one. Now that we change it, we should be able to specify those. This is going to be also the parameters that we need to pass in. So this is going to be basically our ChatGPT request. And then the response is going to be in our ChatGPT response, which needs to match this implementation here. So what I'm going to do, and what I also did previously, is I'm just going to copy this. So I'm going to go here into ChatGPT, and I'm going to say, can you provide me with a JSON, actually with a C# representation based on this JSON object, and it's going to generate it. I think by default it should generate it with the actual JSON property attributes. So as you guys can see here, it actually didn't do that, but we can tell it to do that. Can you regenerate the previous script classes but include JSON property attribute names? And make sure that we don't have a typo, and we can hit enter. Let's see if it's smart enough to know what it needs to generate. And it's actually pretty powerful. It's pretty crazy. And you guys can see now it's generating our JSON property role content and the choices. One thing that I did, though, is I prefixed every single one of them with ChatGPT, and that's because I like code organization when I'm dealing with different technologies. So we can say, while it's writing, we can say something like, can you regenerate the classes with ChatGPT as a prefix. And if you use the API, it's a lot faster, but I wasn't able to pass in code like the JSON file that I sent in here. So I ended up just using chat.openai.com. So now that we have that, though, we can go back into our Unity project, which is going to be here. And we're going to let it compile because we make some changes to the settings, and where that's going to become handy is going to be in the contract, right? Right now, if we go into the response object, you're going to see that I just have data because that's what our Flash service was sending back. So I could do something like I can just paste everything in here, and then basically that's going to be what we need. So what I need to do though is this ChatGPT response, if we go back into the documentation, let's go ahead and look in here and go into the API reference. This is going to be all of these, right? We need an object that represents all of these ones. So let's see if this generated everything that so it's going to be, it's not the ChatGPT usage, it's going to be ChatGPT completion ID object and created. Let me make sure, yeah. So I don't know why I call it ChatGPT completion. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but I'm going to rename that to be the ChatGPT response. And technically, we could also bring in namespace here for the list. And I'm going to be moving this one all the way to the very top. By the time that you get this code, you're going to have everything organized. Right now, we're just going to keep everything in here so that it's easier for us to look at. So that's going to be the first thing. So now if we go into, so this is going to be the response, right? This is going to be what we're going to be getting from ChatGPT, and we're going to be deserializing these data so that we can use it in Unity. So on the ChatGPT request though, right now I have question, and I also, that's really all I have is basically the prompt that I'm going to be executing. So what I'm gonna do though is I have to specify a couple more options in here. I'm gonna remove the question and I'm gonna paste this. It's basically gonna be the model. So it's gonna be that ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo or the other one that we saw on the API reference. I can also specify messages, and this is how you communicate with ChatGPT. If we look at this object and I do F12, you're going to be passing in a role. In our case, the role is going to be user. There's also system. There's also assistant. And you can read more about that in the documentation and in the content, right? It's going to be what we're going to be asking ChatGPT to do. And I'm sure there's a lot more than what I'm describing today, but I think this is going to get us moving forward to be able to implement this. So the next thing that I need to do is we're going to need to modify the ChatGPT client. So if we go back to the client, obviously we're going to get an error here because the object that we are passing to ChatGPT is going to have to change. So we're going to have to do and remove this. And the way that it's going to work though, this is now going to be it's still going to be taking a request, but the request is going to have to include a model, right? So I'm going to have to say model and then ChatGPT settings, and it's going to be the API model that we modify at the beginning. And I'm also going to have to pass in an array of messages. So I'm just going to say messages equal new, and this one is going to be a ChatGPT message array. And the way that you can do this in line is you can just do curly braces, and then I can basically just specify a new chat message and ChatGPT message, and then you can pass in anything that you want to specify to ChatGPT, which in my case, role is going to be user, and then the content is going to be the actual prompt that we're passing into this method. So this should take care of what we need to do with ChatGPT as far as how we ask a question, how we make a request, so we're doing a post. We don't need this debug equal true. This is more for the Flash service to show additional debugging information, but I think for now it's okay, because I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have it available for both. So we're still gonna do, I think I'm still gonna do the request content tab.json. I don't think I removed that on the final code, but we're gonna have to specify a couple of more headers in here. So the other header, because this is now secure, we're gonna have to pass in an authorization header. So if you do authorization, and then the authorization is going to be, you're gonna have to do it this way. So just do bearer, and then we're gonna have to pass in the actual token that we have from ChatGPT, which I'll show you how to get that as well. And then the token is actually going to be, in our case, gonna be the key. So what's gonna happen is whenever we're making a post request, we're going to be passing this, basically it's like a token. It's a secure identifier that if it expires, you won't be able to call it, but it's going to be all tracked through OpenAI. So it's gonna allow us to basically log in and then make a request. And then the next thing that I can do is I'm gonna say, okay, you know what? I also need to specify an organization so that ChatGPT knows who I am. So it's gonna be a combination of organization and also a bear token. So I'm just gonna say organization, and then comma. In the organization, we're just gonna be getting that from the ChatGPT settings. And there are a million ways to do this. This is, like I said, this is just a way that I ended up implementing this. The other thing that you can also do, if you want to look at request start time, and I did this on the final code so that I knew how long this was going to be taking. So So we can just say datetime.now, so we know when that started, and then by the time that it finishes, we would know, how long is that is taking. So we can do something like this on the actual response time. So I'm just gonna do, I think I did on the response, I ended up changing this a little bit. So if we go to the ChatGPT response, I'm going to be adding another property in here. And then this one I decided to do double. And then in the double, I'm just gonna call it response. And we can say total time. And this is gonna be the time in milliseconds that it took to actually make the request. And this is just so that, if you guys wanna know how long it's taking, in my opinion, I think that was very important because I wanted to know how long, this was actually taking. So we can do something like this. And then we can just say response here. Just make sure that, let's see, I'm just gonna do this and response. I'm just going to say response total time. And this is where you can say something like datetime.now. And then we're gonna say minus the actual request start time. And then we can get basically the total amount of milliseconds so that we have that information available for us. So this code right here is gonna change, and it's actually gonna be a lot easier now because we can just say JSON convert, deserialize, and the object that we're gonna be deserializing is gonna be ChatGPT, and it's gonna be the response. And then we need to tell it which string we're going to be deserializing. And then obviously you need to add more error handling in here just in case something happens. We want to make sure that that code doesn't really blow up. So this should allow us to make a call now to ChatGPT. So the next thing that I wanted to show you though is in the ChatGPT tester. A lot of things are going to blow up because now the code that the ChatGPT response is not on the data string. So the way that we can do this now is we can basically just go into our response object here and then go into choices. We can get the first choice, and then the first choice has a message, and we can also grab the content. Sometimes it's good to basically do a nullable just in case this information is null, so we don't get, we don't get an exception, and we can say ChatGPT content. And for now, I'm just going to show you the content that is coming back from ChatGPT so that we know that this is all working. I also changed a lot of these codes, so I'm just gonna go ahead and remove these. And basically, we're just gonna comment this out. I don't wanna run that code right now because I wanna make sure that you know how things are running. So if we go back into our ChatGPT project, now we can make sure, okay, let's see what errors we have. And we need to fix some of these things because if not, it's going to start throwing a lot of errors. So this is going to be the ChatGPT code cleanup code, which I actually changed. I'll just show you. For now, let's just leave it like this, and then we'll go back through and then update that. I'm actually going to be sharing that code so you guys can look at that. Basically, the work of the extension method that I just showed you is basically to get only the source code so that when we run it, it's not including all the information that ChatGPT is describing. So that's what that code cleanup is doing. So if we go to the ChatGPT client, right now we have a lot of information here that we're going to be needing. So if we go back into the OpenAI and we look at the endpoint, so we're gonna need this endpoint first, right? So let's go ahead and get that and then go back into Unity and then just paste it in there. We're also gonna need an API key. So if you go to your account and generate a new API key, we can just do that by doing this. And just make sure you don't use this key. I'm going to be removing these keys as soon as I'm done with this video. So just make sure you log in with your account. And I think you need to set up a payment. It's really cheap. I didn't really notice much of a big cost when it came to calling this, hundreds of times for this video. So I think for development, it's going to be very, very cheap. And then the API model, if we go back here, you're also, so I'm actually going to pull the organization which I can get from settings, and then we can just put that in here. The API model, I'm going to go into my API reference, and then I'm just going to go ahead and grab the GPT-3.5-turbo. That's the one that I've been testing with. And then that should give you everything that we need to do. Okay, so we should be good. I'm going to go ahead and call Ask ChatGPT, and then go into our code. Make sure that we have the prompt, and if we go into the prompt, looks like we have what we specified through the inspector. And then if you look at the URL here, we have the new endpoint. I'm going to go ahead and just unping this information. I'm going to step in, and then step over. So now we have the bytes of this JSON serialized object, which is going to be required for making that call. And then just setting a couple handlers in here, a couple of headers. The authorization header, we have our key here. We have our organization, and I know that because org is a prefix. We have the request start time, which is 12:13 p.m. Mountain Standard. And then now if I step over, we should be getting information here on the response info. If everything works, if it blows up, then we'll find out. And this is the first attempt, and we did get the response back. Obviously, this is really hard to read because it's all condensed, but this is all JSON, so I could put it into VS Code and then basically prettify it, and then you'll be able to see. Actually, let's do that so you guys can see how that looks. So if I were to open VS Code, or you can do that with any tool that you like, I prefer to use this. And then we can just do Control-Shift-P and then JSON. Oh, let me try that again. Control-Shift-P and then JSON pretty print. You're gonna see the data that came back, right? We have ID, object, what I show you on the documentation. And here's the code. Here's the code that is generated from the question that I asked. So that's awesome. So let's go ahead and see if we can deserialize it. And now we should have an object that represents and looks like everything. Yeah, everything looks good. We have our message and we have our content. And now this looks pretty, right? This is what we want. And we actually just got marked down because I think that's what I decided to tell it to only include the code and not everything else. And if you go up, I think is what I think it gets appended at the end. And do not include any explanation. So ChatGPT was smart enough to know to do that. And we have the response time that took, I mean, this says 97 seconds because it's taking into account that I'm doing a debug session, but I think it's taking about from 3 to 6 seconds to be able to call into ChatGPT. And then if I go back and close this, now we can go back into Unity. You're gonna see that now that should be rendered. So let me go ahead and close out of this. I'm just gonna go ahead and stop the debugger because that's making Unity go run slow. So now we can see, right? We have the coding here and we can see that we got the using statements. We have everything that we needed. We also have the class name that we specify. And then in this case, we have number of spheres, a diameter, and there's a private material, which is great because I don't want this to have to force us to create a material or pass in a material through the inspector, because a lot of times that won't happen because this code is going to run a runtime. All right, guys, so this is a new version of the project, which I'm going to be submitting to GitHub. It's going to be public. Everybody can get it. And let me just show you this scene. This is going to be the ChatGPT logger. And this one is going to allow us to ask ChatGPT a question, and we're going to be getting the code back. We're actually going to be able to compile the code because I'm using that Rosling compiler, which I show you in the previous videos how to do that. So this is also using a scriptable object as a question. So I added a lot of features to this. So I think this video will be too long if I walk you through everything, but this is very simple. This is a prompt prefix constant. We're gonna say, this is gonna be a constant that I don't think I need to repeat every single time. So that's what I put it in here. And this says Unity C# script that, and then you can append additional information. In this case, I say 20 primitive type cubes. You can say creates 20 primitive type cubes. I think that's more, that's more correct. So it will say a Unity C# class script that creates 20 primitive type cubes and consistently rotate them along the y-axis at a very fast speed. So, and I also have a few reminders in here. I want to make sure that do not include any explanations. Always include code with markdown. Do not require any prefabs. Do not require any references. And then all the references should not be null. The reason for that is because ChatGPT kept on sending me basically requiring that we pass in references through the inspector. And I don't want to do that if I want to compile this code right away as we get it. All right, so let's go ahead and try it and see what we get. So as soon as we hit ask, you're going to see the title in here. I also have a little progress bar that gets executed. And I'm also basically displaying the prompt that we're asking. So it looks like we got an answer back. And the interesting part is that this took only 5 seconds to execute versus the Python wrapper, which honestly was taking about 30 seconds. Sometimes was timing out. So this is going to be a lot more reliable than using that. So you can see that we have basically a private cubes instance, which is an array. And then it's basically declaring an array of that size. and then going through each cube and then creating a primitive. So, and also going through each one of the cubes and rotating them. So if we hit compile code, we should be able to get a response of what we ask it to do, which is pretty cool. So another thing that I can do though is if I were to, I think I can just go ahead and ask ChatGPT one more time. And you're gonna notice that as soon as I do that, it's going to look a little bit different this time. So we can actually move them down. Let me see if I can grab them all. Move them, maybe keep them in here so we can see the code that got generated. So if I go here, and this is actually appending the code that we got this last time. And this last time is gonna look a little bit different. We now have a list instead of an array. We have the speed specified here and also the rotation. This is also going through the max value, changing the position, and also doing the rotation. So let's try to compile this, and now it looks a little bit different because ChatGPT, it's AI, right? We haven't really told ChatGPT exactly what we wanted, so it has the freedom to choose what to give us. So that is this scene, which I think you're going to enjoy playing with. Now, if you want to do something more robust, in this case, I did another demo, and we can just move this one a little bit. We can probably just move the logger a little bit up so that we can see the code as it comes. So the way that this one works, though, is I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I brought in the started assets, and the started assets include a player armature. So if we look at the tester here, what I'm telling it to do is I say, okay, you know what, ChatGPT, I want a Unity C# class, a script that finds a player armature, game object, and get the started assets input component and sets the move field to a vector 2 with 0.3 flow for X and 0 for Y, which means that it's going to move the character along X at a 0.3 speed. And then I'm also setting the move field to 0 after 3 seconds. And then after that happens, I'm going to be setting the jump field, which is going to allow the character to jump, to true, and then for 3 seconds. So this one might or might not work. I found that about 70% of the time it was working. The other 30% it was causing problems. But it just gives you an idea of the power, right? So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm just gonna go ahead and ask ChatGPT. We're going to be getting, the description that I just specified. And if everything works, I think I should be able to tell whether this is gonna work or not by looking at the code. So this is good. It's basically trying to find the player armature, which you can see here. If it's not null, then it's gonna try to get the started assets input, which I know that this component has. And if you scroll down here, you're gonna see a starter assets input. We can see the move field and the jump field that I specified on the question. So we should be able to get into this code and say, okay, inputs is not null. And if it's not null, it's going to basically do that. And it's going to invoke that every 3 seconds. Actually, it's going to reset the move after 3 seconds. So let's go ahead and try and see what happens. So we're going to go ahead and compile the code, and actually worked the first time. That's funny. So the player, you can see that the player started jumping, and then as soon as we did that, then it started walking. So I think it followed some of the indications that we told it to do. If I were to hit compile again, it's going to execute that one more time. So I'm gonna do one more time. It's doing a jump and then doing a walk right away. So if I were to do this one more time, let's go ahead and hit play here and then restart it. I'm curious to show you what's gonna happen if I do it again. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask ChatGPT for that. This time, let's pay attention to how long it's taking to generate. I didn't look at it last time. You probably will be able to tell that by just going back and looking at the video. Okay, so it looks like it took about, it took about 11 seconds to execute. Okay, not bad, but I think in this case, it's doing something similar. In this case, it's setting the move property right away to 0.3. And then after 3 seconds, it's doing a reset on player input, and you can look at all the coding here as it got generated. So let's go ahead and try to compile it. I'm just going to be lazy and see if this compiles, and looks like it did compile. And now we can see the character starts jumping, actually walking and then jumping. And as soon as that happens, then the player stops. In this instance, I wanted to try to clone the player armature, but load it from resources, which I have it in here. So if we look at the question that I'm gonna be asking it, so this one I'm saying a Unity C# script that loads a player armature from resources consistently every half a second. Get the started assets input component, set the move field to a vector 2 with 1.0 float for X and 0 for Y. Then set the jump field to true. So we're gonna go ahead and try if this is going to work. And I had some really interesting results. It's just when I ran this, so hopefully we get those happening in this instance. So which is interesting because I can't really, guarantee that it's gonna do the same thing, but let's go ahead and try it. So we have a flow timer, we have player input controllers, that's the class that it came up with. And then we have a timer that is getting executed half a second, which is what I specify. As soon as that happens, it sets it to 0, and then it's trying to load the player armature from resources, which is great. And then if it's not null, it's gonna try to get I think this is gonna work. Let's try. If not, then we'll get a compiler error. Okay, so player armature could not be found. And okay, so that makes sense because these player armature load is not correct. So let's try one more time. So that's when I say it's not going to be guaranteed that it's going to work. You can do a retry or be more explicit when you're asking ChatGPT for questions. So, okay, this is gonna work this time because at least on this part, because it's saying I'm gonna load a game object, and then that's going to be the name, and then I'm going to instantiate it. Okay, so let's try this time around. Okay, now I can see the guy just jumping and jumping and jumping, but this time I don't know that it's cloning. I don't know that it's cloning that player controller, and I don't see what it's doing. It's instantiating that, but only on the awake, even though I told that code to basically consistently, let's say consistently every half a second. Okay, so let's see if we can do that one more time. I'm gonna go ahead and ask ChatGPT one more time. From resources consistently every half a second. Okay, I don't know that I'm telling it. Well, I'm telling it to do it every half a second. So let's try one more time and see what happens. Okay, so there's a while looping here, which could be dangerous, but it is an enumerator with a coroutine. And I think this is going to work because it is loading also a player armature from a game object, and then it's also instantiating it every single time. And there is a wait for seconds, which is half a second, which is what I was expecting. Okay, there we go. So this time he got it right, and you can kind of hear the sounds of it. Actually, when they land and when they start walking, it just looks like an army is starting to march. And you guys can see here that they are all getting instantiated. So that's honestly everything that I wanted to show you. There's unlimited use cases and things that we can do with these. But if you like these, let me know in the comments and I'll be able to, create more videos. Or if you have a specific use case that you want me to look at, let me know as well. But that's everything for today. And again, if you can subscribe and set the ring to the notification bell to true. I was gonna say true in code, but basically set it so that you can get notified when I release new videos. Please do so because that's gonna help me with future videos. So thank you very much, guys.